Alright, let me tell you about this one train ride I had that still creeps me out whenever I think about it. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a routine trip, something I'd done 100 times before. But that night, everything felt off, like the whole world had shifted a little bit out of place. It was a late Friday evening, and I was heading back home after spending the day in the city. I'd been visiting some friends, catching up, the usual stuff, and I lost track of time. By the time I got to the train station, it was already dark, and the place was nearly empty. You know that feeling you get in an almost deserted place? Like everything's quiet, too quiet, and the usual background noise just fades away. That's how it felt. I bought my ticket and headed to the platform. There were only a handful of people around, mostly scattered along the length of the platform, keeping to themselves. I picked a spot under one of the lights, trying to stay in the glow, where it felt a bit safer. The train rolled in after a few minutes, this old creaking thing that looked like it had seen better days. The kind of train that groans every time it comes to a stop, like it's complaining about having to move. I got on and found a seat in one of the middle cars. The train was mostly empty, maybe 3 or 4 other people spread out. There was a guy in a suit looking half asleep, a couple of teenagers with earbuds in, not even talking to each other, and an older woman reading a book. I figured I'd get a row to myself. So I plopped down by the window, put my backpack on the seat next to me, and got comfortable. The train started moving, and I pulled out my phone, scrolling through social media, just killing time. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks was kind of soothing, and I felt myself relaxing, almost dozing off. The lights in the train flickered a bit, but I didn't think much of it. Old train, probably just bad wiring or something. We were about 20 minutes into the ride when things started to feel strange. The train was passing through a wooded area, trees lining both sides of the track, their branches arching over, making it feel like we were moving through a tunnel. That's when the train started to slow down. Not at a station, but right in the middle of nowhere. It came to a complete stop, and the lights flickered again, this time going out for a few seconds before coming back on. I looked around, but nobody else seemed concerned. The guy in the suit was still half asleep. The teenagers were staring at their phones, and the old woman kept reading her book like nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling, like something wasn't right. After a few minutes, the train started moving again, slowly at first, then picking up speed. I tried to brush off the weird feeling, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe there was an animal on the tracks, or maybe the conductor just needed to check something. But that uneasy feeling stuck with me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I went back to scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself, but every now and then, I'd glance up and look around the train car. The lights kept flickering, and each time they did, the shadows seemed to stretch and move, like something was shifting in the darkness. We were moving along for another 20 minutes or so when the train started slowing down again. This time it came to a stop near an old, run-down station that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were no lights, no signs of life, just an empty platform covered in graffiti and weeds growing through the cracks. The doors didn't open, and there was no announcement. We just sat there, the train idling, the sound of the engine humming through the car. I looked around, expecting someone else to react, but everyone else seemed oblivious. Even the conductor didn't come over the intercom to say why we'd stopped. I started feeling a bit nervous. Something about the station outside, the darkness pressing against the windows, made me feel trapped. I pulled out my phone, thinking I'd text a friend and tell them about the weird stop, but of course there was no signal. The train was too far out in the middle of nowhere. A few minutes passed, and then the train finally started moving again. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and tried to relax, but the train was moving slower now, and the lights kept flickering more often. I could see the shadows moving again, stretching across the floor and walls, almost like they were alive. I glanced over at the guy in the suit. He'd woken up and was looking around, confusion on his face. The teenagers had taken out their earbuds and were glancing at each other, clearly starting to feel the weird vibe too. The old woman had put down her book and was staring straight ahead, her expression blank. That's when I heard it, a faint noise coming from the back of the train. It was soft at first, like a distant echo, but it grew louder, a rhythmic tapping, almost like footsteps. I turned in my seat, trying to see down the aisle, but the lights were too dim, and I couldn't make out much past a few rows. The tapping got louder, more distinct, like someone was walking down the aisle. one slow step at a time. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but the sound seemed to be everywhere, echoing through the car. The other passengers started noticing too, shifting in their seats, looking around, their faces mirroring my own confusion and unease. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The train was still moving, the lights still flickering, but everything else was silent. I felt this chill run down my spine, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. My heart was pounding, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I kept looking around, expecting to see someone or something appear at the end of the aisle, but there was nothing. Just empty seats and shadows. The unease in the car was almost palpable, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The train kept moving, and after a few minutes, I started to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe it was just the train's old pipes or something, making that tapping noise. I tried to settle back into my seat, telling myself to calm down. But then the lights went out completely, plunging the car into darkness. I heard someone gasp, and my own heart skipped a beat. I pulled out my phone, using the screen's light to see, and noticed the guy in the suit doing the same. The teenagers were whispering to each other, and the old woman had her eyes closed, as if she was trying to block everything out. The train slowed down again, coming to another stop. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I turned my head toward the window, using my phone's light to see. We were stopped at another station, just as run down and abandoned as the last one. But this time, I saw something. A figure standing on the platform, just barely visible in the darkness. It was too far to make out any details, just a silhouette, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I wasn't the only one who saw it. The guy in the suit was staring out the window too, his eyes wide. One of the teenagers stood up, trying to get a better look. I could hear them whispering to each other, their voices tinged with panic. The train doors stayed closed, and the figure on the platform didn't move. We just sat there, staring at each other through the darkness. I felt trapped, my skin crawling with that same feeling of unease. I didn't know what to do. Should I get up, try to find the conductor? Should I stay put? Then, without warning, the train started moving again. The figure on the platform disappeared from view, swallowed up by the darkness. The lights flickered back on, and everything seemed normal again. But that feeling of dread stayed with me, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. The rest of the ride was tense. Every time the train slowed down, my heart would jump, and I'd brace myself for another stop, another figure in the dark. But we didn't stop again. The train kept moving, taking us closer to the city, closer to safety. When we finally pulled into the station, I grabbed my backpack and got off the train as fast as I could. The guy in the suit, the teenagers, the old woman, they all did the same, scattering into the crowd like they couldn't get away fast enough. I didn't look back at the train. I just kept walking, blending into the flow of people, trying to shake off that feeling of being watched. I still don't know what happened that night, if it was all in my head or if there really was someone or something on that platform. But ever since then, I've been wary of late-night train rides, always glancing over my shoulder, listening for that faint tapping noise. Maybe it was just my imagination, maybe not. But whatever it was, it left a mark. That sense of unease, of something lurking just out of sight, waiting to make itself known. That's a feeling I can't shake. And every time I step onto a train now, especially at night, I feel that same chill run down my spine, like the darkness is hiding something I'm not meant to see. So let me tell you about this one time I took a train ride that I'll never forget. It was supposed to be just another boring commute, nothing out of the ordinary. But what ended up happening was probably the creepiest experience of my life. It was winter, and it was already dark by the time I got to the station. I remember feeling a chill run through me as I walked down the platform, not just because of the cold, but because of the atmosphere. The station was almost empty, just a handful of people scattered around, bundled up in their coats, waiting for the train. The platform lights flickered every now and then, casting weird shadows on the ground. There was something eerie about the whole place that night. I was heading back home after visiting a friend who lived a few towns over. It wasn't a long trip, maybe an hour or so by train, but I was tired and just wanted to get home, have a hot shower, and relax. The train finally pulled up, its brakes screeching as it slowed to a stop. I got on, found a seat in the middle car, and settled in, hoping to doze off for a bit. The car was mostly empty, just a few other passengers sitting scattered around. There was an old man a couple of rows ahead of me, his head buried in a newspaper, and a woman with a toddler in the corner, trying to keep the kid entertained. There was also a guy sitting near the back, looking out the window, but I couldn't see much of him from where I was sitting. I put my headphones on, started scrolling through my phone, and tried to zone out. The train started moving, the familiar rhythm of the wheels on the tracks creating a kind of lulling, steady sound. I was almost drifting off when I noticed something strange. The lights in the car flickered, just for a second, but enough to catch my attention. I glanced up, but everything seemed normal, so I went back to my phone. A few minutes later, the lights flickered again, this time staying off for a little longer before coming back on. I could see the other passengers looking around, confused. The old man with the newspaper lowered it and glanced around the car, his brow furrowed. The woman with the toddler held her kid a little closer. I could feel my heart rate pick up a bit, but I told myself it was probably just a glitch or some maintenance issue. Then the train started to slow down. We weren't near a station. I knew the route well enough to know that much. We were in the middle of a stretch of track that ran through a wooded area, with nothing but trees and darkness outside. The train came to a full stop, the lights flickering once more before settling into a dim, almost yellowish glow. I took off my headphones and looked around. The other passengers seemed just as puzzled as I was. The old man folded his newspaper and set it on his lap, looking out the window like he was trying to figure out where we were. The woman with the toddler whispered something to her child, her eyes darting nervously around the car. For a few minutes, nothing happened. We just sat there, the train silent except for the faint hum of the engine. No announcements, no explanation, just that thick, unsettling silence. I felt a knot forming in my stomach, that instinctive feeling you get when you know something's not right. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a noise, a faint scraping sound coming from the roof of the train car. It was so quiet at first, I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. It sounded like something or someone was moving along the roof, dragging against the metal. I looked around to see if anyone else had heard it. The old man was staring at the ceiling, his eyes wide. The woman with the toddler was holding her kid tight, whispering to him to keep still. The guy near the back of the car was still looking out the window, but his posture had stiffened, like he was on edge too. The scraping continued, moving from one end of the car to the other, then back again. It was a deliberate sound, like someone was walking on the roof, slowly and carefully. My mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon or something, but that didn't make sense. We were in the middle of nowhere, and the sound was too controlled, too purposeful to be an animal. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and this time they went out completely. The car was plunged into darkness, and I could hear the collective gasp of the passengers. I felt my heart jump into my throat. The scraping sound stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press down on us. I could feel the darkness closing in, the uncertainty of what was happening making my skin crawl. For what felt like an eternity, we sat there in the dark, the only sounds the occasional creak of the train settling on the tracks, and the nervous shuffling of the passengers. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. Then the lights flickered back on, casting a dim glow over the car. I looked around, trying to gauge everyone's reactions. The old man had his hands clenched in his lap, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. The woman was still holding her toddler, her face pale and tense. The guy at the back was now standing, looking out the window with a concerned expression. I thought about getting up, maybe going to find the conductor, but something kept me rooted in my seat. Fear, probably, but also this sense that if I moved, I'd be exposing myself to whatever was out there. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, half expecting to see something break through it at any moment. The train lurched forward suddenly, jerking everyone in their seats. The scraping noise started again, louder this time, as if whatever was on the roof was trying to keep up with the moving train. The lights flickered once more, and I felt my heart pound faster. I heard a thud from the back of the car, followed by the sound of a door sliding open. I turned to look, but I couldn't see clearly from where I was sitting. I thought I saw the silhouette of the guy who had been standing, but then he was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the next car. The train picked up speed, and the lights stopped flickering, but the scraping sound persisted. I felt trapped, like there was nowhere to go, no way to escape whatever was out there. I could hear the old man muttering to himself, his voice shaky. The woman with the toddler was whispering softly, trying to calm her child. After a few minutes, the train started to slow down again. This time, I could see lights in the distance, an upcoming station. Relief washed over me, and I felt my muscles relax slightly. I kept my eyes on the station lights, willing the train to get there faster. As we pulled into the station, the train came to a stop, and the doors slid open. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the door, my heart pounding. I stepped out onto the platform, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I looked around, expecting to see the other passengers following me, but no one else got off the train. The platform was empty, except for a few flickering streetlights and the distant sound of a car passing by. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the cold air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I looked back at the train, half expecting to see something, or someone, looking back at me, but the windows were dark and I couldn't see anything inside. I debated whether to wait for the next train or call someone to pick me up. I didn't feel safe getting back on, not after what I just experienced. I decided to call a friend and ask for a ride. As I pulled out my phone, I noticed the train's doors had closed, and it started to move again, slowly pulling out of the station. I watched as the train disappeared into the darkness, the sound of its wheels on the tracks fading away. I stood there on the platform, phone in hand, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of the scraping sounds, the flickering lights, the sense of being watched. To this day, I don't know what was on the roof of that train or what caused those sounds. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe there was something more to it. But ever since that night, I've been wary of train rides, especially when I'm traveling alone. I can't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us, following us through the darkness, and every time I hear the faintest scrape or creak on a train, I'm taken back to that night, the flickering lights, and the unsettling silence. It's a feeling I wouldn't wish on anyone, that sense of being alone in the dark with something you can't see but know is there, waiting. This is a story that still creeps me out when I think about it. It's not the kind of thing you expect to happen, especially on something as routine as a train ride, but it did. And every time I'm on a train now, I can't help but remember that night. It was a few years ago. I was coming back from visiting a friend in another city. It was one of those weekend trips where you just hang out, catch up, maybe have a few too many drinks. By the time Sunday rolled around, I was tired, but in a good way, you know? Ready to head home, relax, and get some decent sleep before starting the week again. I got to the train station in the early evening, around 7 p.m. It was one of those old stations, kind of run down but still functional, the kind that's been around forever, with long wooden benches and those big clock faces that look like they haven't been updated in decades. The train wasn't due for another 20 minutes, so I grabbed a coffee from the little kiosk near the platform and found a bench to sit on. There were a few other people around, mostly couples and families, and one or two guys who looked like they were heading home from work. Normal crowd for a Sunday evening, I guess. I was scrolling through my phone, not really paying attention, just passing the time, when I noticed this guy standing off to the side, near one of the pillars. He looked out of place. Not in a dramatic way, but just odd. He was wearing a dark coat, and his hair was a little messy, like he hadn't brushed it in a while. He had this old beat-up backpack slung over one shoulder. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just kind of standing there, looking around like he was waiting for someone. Every now and then, he'd glance over at me, but when our eyes met, he'd look away, pretending he hadn't been staring. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just nervous, or maybe he thought he recognized me from somewhere. Whatever, people are weird sometimes. The train finally arrived, and I got on, finding an empty seat near the back of one of the middle cars. I liked sitting by the window, watching the world go by. There's something calming about the steady motion of a train. The way the scenery changes, but the rhythm stays the same. I settled in, put my headphones on, and pulled out my book. ready to just zone out for the next couple of hours until I got home. The train started moving and everything seemed fine. The car was pretty empty, just a few people scattered around, most of them keeping to themselves. I was reading, half listening to some music, when I felt that weird sensation you get when someone's watching you. I looked up and there he was, the guy from the station. He was sitting a few rows ahead of me, turned slightly so he could look back in my direction. I tried to play it cool, just glanced at him and then went back to my book, but I could feel his eyes on me. It was like he was studying me, trying to figure something out. My skin started to crawl a little, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe he just happened to pick that seat, and it was a coincidence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. About an hour into the ride, the train started to empty out as we passed through the smaller towns. The car was almost deserted now, just me, the guy, and maybe one or two other passengers way at the front. The conductor came through, checking tickets, and I used the distraction to get up and move a few seats back, putting more distance between me and the guy. I figured if he really was watching me, he'd have to make it obvious to keep doing it. But then something strange happened. The train came to a stop, not at a station, just in the middle of nowhere. I looked out the window, but it was too dark to see much, just the outlines of trees and an empty field. The conductor didn't make any announcements, which was weird, and nobody came by to explain why we'd stopped. I glanced up the aisle and saw the guy standing now, looking out the window too. He seemed tense, like he was waiting for something. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The car was too quiet, like everyone was holding their breath. I considered getting up and going to find the conductor, but before I could make a move, the train's lights flickered. Just for a second, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. The lights flickered again, and this time they went out completely. We were plunged into darkness. I could hear a few gasps, some murmuring from up ahead, and then silence. My phone was in my pocket, and I pulled it out, using the screen to give myself some light. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it down the aisle. The guy was gone. His seat was empty. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. Where had he gone? There was no way he could have gotten off the train. It was too far from any station, and the doors hadn't opened. I stood up, looking around, trying to see if he'd moved to another seat or if maybe he was just hiding in the dark. And then I heard it, a soft creaking sound, like someone moving down the aisle, trying to be quiet. I swung my phone's light in that direction, but there was nothing, just the empty seats and the shadows beyond. My heart was racing now. I knew I wasn't alone in the car, but I couldn't see him. I took a step back, my mind racing with what to do. Should I call for help? Try to find the conductor? But then I heard another sound, this time from behind me, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against fabric. I turned around, shining my light into the darkness, and there he was. The guy was standing just a few feet away, his face half hidden in the shadows. He was staring at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there, watching. My hand tightened around my phone, and I felt like I might scream, but I didn't. Instead, I took a step back, putting more distance between us. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't respond, just kept staring. Then, slowly, he raised a hand and pointed to the window. I glanced over, but all I saw was darkness. When I looked back, he was closer, his hand still raised. I felt like my legs were going to give out from under me. I turned and started walking, fast, down the aisle toward the next car. I didn't look back. I pushed through the door to the next car, almost tripping over my own feet. This car was empty too, but it was brighter, the emergency lights on above the doors. I kept moving, making my way toward the front of the train, looking for the conductor or anyone who could help. As I reached the third car, I found the conductor, slumped over in one of the seats, his hat pulled low over his face. I felt a wave of relief, rushing over, ready to tell him about the guy. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The conductor wasn't moving. His skin was pale, too pale, and there was a strange, sickly sweet smell in the air. I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. I needed to get out of there. I turned and started running back through the cars, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I reached my car again, but it was empty. The guy was gone. The lights flickered back on, and I could see his backpack still sitting on the seat, like he'd just disappeared. The train started moving again, lurching forward with a jolt. I stumbled, catching myself on one of the seats, and looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind was racing, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get off the train. But we were moving too fast now, heading toward the next station. I stayed in my seat, my eyes locked on the door, waiting for the guy to come back, but he never did. When we pulled into the next station, I practically bolted out of the train, my heart still racing. I looked around, trying to spot him in the crowd, but there was no sign of him. It was like he'd never been there. I reported what happened to the station staff, told them about the guy and the conductor, but they looked at me like I was crazy. They checked the train, but everything was normal. The conductor was there, alive and well, and they said there was no sign of any guy matching the description I gave. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But I know what I saw, and I know how it felt. I've taken trains since then, but I'm always on edge, always watching the other passengers, waiting to see that guy again. Because something about him wasn't right. The way he watched me, the way he moved. It was like he was waiting for something only he knew about. And that thought still keeps me up at night, wondering if I'll ever see him again, and if next time I won't be so lucky.